Okay, welcome to the video on the English Civil War. For this video here, there's going to actually be two videos. This is part one. Part one is going to cover the events leading up to the English Civil War, and then we'll break, and then the second video will cover the Civil War and the aftermath of it. So for this video, as you follow along with this lecture and the notes here, you should have this set of notes in front of you, all right? So you have your terms to know in the upper right-hand corner. We have some notes here leading through into the English Civil War. So with your notes in front of you, let's get started. So you can see here the years of the English Civil War from 1642 to 1651. We are kind of straddling the College Board time periods here. The first time period ends in 1648. So these events, everything leading up to the Civil War, and then a good portion of the actual war take place in the first time period, if we're being very strict about these years. And then the second half and then the aftermath of the Civil War take place in the second half of the time period. So this is one of those weird things that you could probably argue that there should be different periodization involved here. But, just for the sense of, I'm mentioning this for the sense of making sure that you guys understand where this fits into our chronology. So let's talk about the English Civil War. It's just like in American history, how people have kind of been fascinated with the American Civil War. I think the same is true in England, is that this is a period of time they look back on as kind of a very important period in their history, and it can definitely probably be argued as a turning point in English history, as well as maybe the history of Europe. You can decide that when we're through. So let's get some background information here about the English Civil War. So Elizabeth I dies with no heir. If you recall, Elizabeth was the Virgin Queen. She did not get married. She did not have any children. So when she dies, her next closest relative, who has the best claim to the throne, is her cousin's son, who is King James VI of Scotland at the time. So he's the King of Scotland. He's been the King of Scotland for many years. He was raised as a king. He was raised as royalty. And you can tell by his quote here, he calls himself an old king, experienced king, needing no lessons. So he's kind of already set in his ways. He's kind of like, I know how to be king. You don't have to tell me how to do it. So that's going to end up being important here as James comes into the throne of England, is that he's already set in his ways and he's going to want to do things his way. That's going to cause some tensions. Now, as a side note, you should note here that the crowns of England and Scotland will now be united. England and Scotland had a long history of conflict where England tried to conquer them a couple of times and the Scottish went for their independence. And they had not the greatest relationship throughout all of this. Now, Scotland had been an independent nation up until this point, but now that James is the King of Scotland and the King of England, those two territories will be united. And this continues until the present day, is that England and Scotland are still under the crown of the British Empire, still united together. So just in case you're interested here, how is James related to Elizabeth? Well, here we can find Elizabeth here on our Tudor family tree. There's Elizabeth. There's James down there. So the connection is through his mother, Mary Queen of Scots. His mother's grandmother was Margaret Tudor. Margaret Tudor is the sister of Henry the Eighth. So you got to kind of find Henry VIII here and like follow this red line down. There's his sister Margaret. His sister had married James of Scotland, and it is James's great grandchild who becomes the king. Well, it gets a little complicated. Everybody has the same name. They're all related to each other somehow. If you have any questions, just come and see me. Let me know. But basically, this is how he has the connection. It's through Henry VIII's sister Margaret is how James and Elizabeth are related. Also, side note also, Mary Queen of Scots was James's mother. That is the same Mary Queen of Scots that Elizabeth had executed a few decades before for plotting against her to remove her from the throne. So, kind of ironic that she kills Mary and then James ends up becoming the King of England. So when James becomes the king, he now establishes the Stuart monarchy. So Elizabeth is the last of our Tudor monarchs, and now we usher in the Stuart age. The Stuarts are going to do things differently than the Tudors. And that's where we're going to start to see some problems. So some background on James I. James I, King of England from 1603 to 1625. So from the very beginning, James faces problems. He's seen as a foreigner because he's Scottish. Also, as you should note from the document work we've already done in class, James I was a very ardent believer in the absolute rule of kings. He supported divine right, and he completely supported the idea that kings were gods on earth and therefore should have absolute rule and absolute power over everything. So the problem here, which is the difference here than what's going on in France, is that you have a strong tradition of parliament in England, where the king, at least in theory, shared or had to submit some of its power to the will of parliament. So from the very beginning, James is going to clash with parliament over two things: the view of the monarchy as well as money. So the money is going to be the root cause of all these problems. Money makes the world go round, if you've heard that before. So the problem for James is that the wars against Spain had left a very considerable debt. Going back to the days of the Spanish Armada, you saw there the Spanish had constantly tried to invade England. England was at war with Spain. Later on, they're going to go to war with France. I mean, and war is expensive. So James has a considerable debt. And remember, Parliament had a tradition of what was called the power of the purse, meaning that Parliament had control of money. They were the ones that traditionally had approved taxes. They were the ones that traditionally would levy taxes on the people. Well, James, with his view of absolute rule of kings, is not going to agree with this view. He's going to think he can do whatever the heck he wants to do. If he wants to impose taxes, he's going to impose taxes. Parliament is not going to stand for this. So also keep in mind, place this in context with what's going on historically. The 17th century is a time of rising prices. We're in the midst of that price revolution. That's adding some more economic problems, which is going to make James want to just impose these taxes even more. So pretty early on in his reign, he makes many enemies. Two important things happen during his reign that represent these enemies. Number one is the so-called gunpowder plot that takes place. So this is led by someone named Guy Fawkes. And by led, I mean Guy Fawkes was a member of this, and he happened to be the one that took the fall. Was he really the advocate or the leader for this? Probably not, but he is the fall guy. He's the guy whose name has been associated with the gunpowder plot since then. So basically, the bottom line is this plot is you have disgruntled Catholics who are plotting to overthrow the government. James himself is a Protestant, but his family members were Catholic. And so the Catholics there were hoping the fact that he came from Scotland, that his family members were Catholic, that he had a history of Catholicism in his family, that he would kind of be a little more open to Catholics gaining more rights and to Catholicism expanding in England. So when James became king, and James did not show really any sympathy to the Catholics, they got angry, and so they plotted to overthrow the government. Because what else do you do when you're angry? Let's plot to overthrow the government. So in this gunpowder plot, Guy Fawkes and his buddies plan to blow up Parliament during their opening because they know the king always came to the opening of Parliament to open it up. So the king would be there as well as all the major members of Parliament. However, right before this event is supposed to take place, a member of Parliament receives an anonymous letter warning him of the plot. All of the conspirators, including Guy Fawkes, are arrested and executed for their involvement in the plot. So this is nothing actually happens with this, but this has still been greatly remembered throughout English history. It's a great example of the discontent people had with James. Also today, every year on the 5th of November, remember the 5th of November, they have Guy Fawkes Night in England where people wear Guy Fawkes masks. Yes, those are masks that are supposed to represent the face of Guy Fawkes, and they burn effigies, they set off fireworks, and they march through the streets celebrating what took place. If that mask of Guy Fawkes looks familiar, you might have seen it maybe if you've seen the movie V for Vendetta, or if you've read the graphic novel that the movie is based on. One of the characters wears that Guy Fawkes mask. If you've also ever heard of Anonymous, that international network of activists and hacktivists who take it upon themselves to release information and battle government power and all of that, they also wear the Guy Fawkes masks. So these masks are and the legend of Guy Fawkes is still connected with the idea of trying to challenge the government, trying to help the people, still something that is alive and well in Western culture as well as in English culture. Um, so even though we still know Guy Fawkes' name, even though his face has now been made into a creepy mask and he lives on in infamy, his last moments on Earth were not so great. The execution of the men behind the gunpowder plot faced the worst execution of treason that you could possibly have. Pretty brutal for him, but hey, at least now you can go out and wear a mask of his face and talk about him, which I'm sure he would love. So the second major event in James's reign was something called the Addled Parliament. So in 1614, James calls Parliament to session. However, pretty much from the beginning, James begins arguing with the members of Parliament about levying taxes. Remember, James, absolute monarch, believes he should just be able to levy taxes. If he wants money and he wants taxes from his subjects, he should just be able to do it. When Parliament kind of stands in his way and is like, no, 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 we have to approve of it, we have to agree with it, this is just what we do, we have the power of the purse. James then argues, well, what do you mean? I'm the king, I'm God on earth, I should just be able to do what I want, and so on and so forth. And the arguments continued throughout the entire session. James is not satisfied with Parliament's response. They get nowhere. So finally, James is just like, you know what? Forget it. I'm dissolving Parliament, which he fully had the power to do. So he dissolves Parliament, and he's not going to call Parliament again for a number of years. Now, in addition to those issues, there's also some religious issues still in England. Now, we did talk about the fact that Elizabeth I, as a politique, did settle a lot of these religious tensions by making England Protestant but leaving things open to the Catholics. Yes, there were no more religious wars that took place, no more Bloody Mary situations where people are being burnt at the stake. However, there are still a lot of religious issues bubbling under the surface in England. Now, many members of Parliament were Puritans. Do you remember who the Puritans are? Hopefully right now you are thinking that they are the English Calvinists. Now, the English Calvinists, the reason why they are called Puritans is because they felt that the Anglican Church was too Catholic, that they allowed too many Catholic influences to remain. So they wanted to purify the Anglican Church of all those Catholic influences. Now, James himself, remember, is a Protestant, and he's supported by a lot of the bishops of the Anglican Church. So the Puritans, who don't approve of the Anglican Church, right, they think it's too Catholic, they want to purify it, they're going to clash now with James. So on top of his view of absolute monarchy, on top of the issues over taxation, now you also have these religious issues under the surface too, that a lot of these MPs are Puritans, while James is supported by the Anglican Church. Now, all of James's reign was not all terrible. There were some highlights. The first successful English colony took place during his reign, Jamestown, Virginia, named Jamestown after King James. Also in 1611, the first translation of the Bible into English for the Anglican Church was made, and this was called the King James Bible. This is still the version, or an English version of the Bible, that is still very widely read today. It is still called the King James Bible. So he has that going for him. So despite all those issues, not everything was terrible. Now in 1625, James dies, and his son Charles comes to the throne. And right away, from the very beginning, everybody sees Charles is going to be just like his father. In many ways, he's worse than his father. His beliefs were even stronger than his father. The same idea, belief in absolute rule, belief in power of the monarch. So he continues to clash with Parliament. And this is where the main issue comes in. Once again, money. He needs money. So almost immediately into his reign, he has no choice but to go to Parliament to get the money. He could try to impose taxes, but if the local lords aren't going to go around and collect them for him or enforce it in their territory, there's very little that Charles can do. So he needs the support of Parliament, so he goes to Parliament. Parliament, like seeing what had happened with James and knowing that they had fought for decades and it got them nowhere, they basically say, listen, we're not giving you any money until you agree to this petition of right. We need you to agree to some things, and then we'll give you some money. So Charles, being in this situation, he needs the money, so he reluctantly decides to agree to the petition of right. Now, in the petition of right, Charles agrees that He would not imprison subjects without due cause. He would not levy taxes without Parliament's consent. He would not house soldiers in private homes. And he would not impose martial law in peacetime. Martial law is rule by the military. So, simple enough, he signs to it, he says, yeah, I promise for all those things, now give me my money. Well, Parliament gives him his money, and then pretty much Charles begins to ignore the Petition of Right. Again, he believes that he is a divine monarch. He doesn't have to answer to anybody, especially Parliament. So even though he signed that Petition of Right, doesn't mean he actually has to use it. So pretty much, excuse me, after he signs the Petition of Right, he ignores it. Then he decides he doesn't need Parliament at all anymore, and he dissolves Parliament. He will now rule England for 11 years without a Parliament. But he still needs money, right? He hasn't fixed that problem of trying to get money. He's fighting wars with France, he's fighting wars with Spain, the crown needs revenue. So in this 11-year span, how is he going to get money? Well, he gets pretty creative. And he goes back and he finds some old medieval laws that he's able to manipulate to get money. The most famous example of that is something that's been called the ship money controversy. And in the ship money controversy, Charles enacts an old medieval law that coastal towns would provide ships for the king's service in a time of war, right? So they had this old law that basically said, hey, if it's a time of warfare, these coastal towns have to give ships to the king. Well, England's not at war at the time, but Charles decides to take this law and says, well, I want to maintain a navy during peacetime, so I'm going to need the ships anyway. But instead of giving me ships, why don't you just give me money to pay for the navy? So he basically says, I'm going to take this law and we're going to turn it into, now you have to give me money to support a navy. And you need to do it right now because I need a navy. He then also expands this, and it's going to be not just the coastal towns. It's not just going to be the coastal towns that are going to pay us money. The whole country as a whole is going to pay this money to support the navy. So he's really making a stretch here. He's really getting creative, basically creating a whole new law that basically just says pay money for the navy. But because he kind of manipulated a law that already existed, it was technically legal in the terms of the time. So there are many members of Parliament who represent the inland country gentlemen, the ones that aren't on the coastal towns, and they're super pissed because they're like, we never had to pay this before. Now this is basically just a tax that you're making us pay. And so they resented having to pay for a navy because they're also like, hey, we don't live on the coast. The navy's not going to help us in any way, but yet we have to pay you money for a navy. So that just creates all this controversy and all this issues, and it further increases the tensions here between Parliament and Charles. And the religious issues that started or had been occurring with James will now continue with Charles. And Charles actually is going to be much more strict in his view of religion. He appoints a man named Bishop Laud to deal with the Puritan resistance. And Bishop Laud deals with it by basically persecuting Puritans and trying to force the Anglican worship on them. Fun fact, side note everybody, this is the period here when a bunch of Puritans will decide they've had enough with the Stuart persecutions of them, and they're all going to pack on a boat, sail across the Atlantic Ocean, and go create a colony in Massachusetts Bay where they're going to be able to practice their faith freely and create themselves a model community based on their ideas. So, just in terms of some context, this is why the Puritans leave England, is because the Stuarts under James I and Charles I persecuted them and tried to force the Anglican worship on them. So they left for religious freedom. Now also Charles is married to a Catholic, which makes the religious tensions and religious issues even worse because it's like, well, he has secret Catholic sympathies and all the people that are super Protestant don't like this, and there are all those issues with that. There's Bishop William Laud. He's the one that launches the persecutions against the Puritans. He forces the Anglican services and traditions upon them. Obviously, the Puritans respond. They're not happy with this. They're angry. Some of them leave, but some of them also kind of start rallying some resistance against the king. And to make matters all worse, as if all these tensions were not enough, in 1637, the Presbyterians, also the Calvinists, in Scotland, decide to rebel when Bishop Laud tries to impose the Anglican Church's prayer book on them. This is probably where Charles makes his vital mistake, is that he should have just kind of picked his battles here. And was it really that important to him that the people in Scotland had to use the Anglican prayer book. But to Charles, yes, it was. And to Bishop Laud, yes, it was. And they launched this campaign here to force the Presbyterians to use the Anglican prayer book. And this will lead to a rebellion. And the rebellion of the Scots in 1637 is really the event that tips the scales towards war. Because Charles cannot stop this rebellion without Parliament's help. He needs the support of the nobles. He needs more money. He needs to be able to raise an army. He cannot do that without the nobles' support. So in 1640, he is forced to call Parliament for the first time in 11 years. So he calls Parliament, and again, because none of these issues had been resolved, the Parliament and King almost immediately begin to argue. Charles dissolves Parliament. He's like, forget this. Let's get some new blood in here. He calls for new elections. Unfortunately for Charles, the same exact men are elected in these new elections, and the same exact men return to London. This puts us now on the path to war. This Parliament, these men that return here to London, they will be known as the Long Parliament because they would meet uninterrupted for the next 20 years. And if you remember the years, they'll be the Parliament that's meeting during this Civil War. Now, knowing that Charles is in a bad situation, Parliament decides that we've got him where we want him. He has to agree to these terms because otherwise he's going to lose Scotland. And so Parliament presses its own demands. Part of his demands. Well, they arrest Charles's chief minister, the Earl of Strafford. They arrest him, they execute him. Then they push through some acts. They ensure that Parliament's going to meet every year and could not be dissolved without its own consent. So they're going to be like, enough with this stuff about the king just getting rid of us when he doesn't want us. Nope, we're pushing through this act. That can't happen. They abolish the special privilege courts that were seen as challenging the supremacy of law. They declare the collection of any non-parliamentary taxation, such as that ship money, illegal. They arrest Bishop Laud. They have Bishop Laud executed. And they push through this so-called Root and Branch Bill, which abolished the bishops and made the Church of England more like the Scottish Presbyterian Church. So Parliament's making some pretty serious demands here, some pretty significant, massive changes they want to take place. And Charles, again, deeply believes in divine right, deeply believes in absolute rule. He's not going to take too well to these things that take place. But then, of course, the Irish then rebel. Now, Ireland had also had a very tricky history with the British. Pretty much in the time of the Tudors, the English had started to move to Ireland. The Protestant British landowners began to buy up lots of land. The native Irish became the peasants living on the land, and the Protestant landowners became the ones who owned the land. And this caused a lot of tension, led to a lot of exploitation of the Irish. Now, the Irish are mostly Catholic. In this rebellion, they rebel against their Protestant and British landlords. So now he's got a rebellion in Scotland, a rebellion in Ireland. He's got no money. He's got no one to pay for his army, and he's clashing with Parliament. So all of these events are going to increase the tensions between Parliament and the king. Finally, tensions come to the surface, and Charles decides enough is enough. I am the king. I need to assert my authority as the king. So he decides he's going to take the 5 most troublesome members of Parliament, the 5 people that he believes has been stirring up all of these issues, and he decides he's going to arrest them. Well, somebody had tipped these 5 off, and they managed to literally sneak out the back of the Parliament, of the Houses of Parliament. And when Charles walks in, as you can tell by this exchange here, the members of Parliament in the building cover for them, and Charles is basically, well, I guess I've seen they've flown, can't arrest them. And at this point, war starts. So in 1642, that's when Charles attempts to arrest the 5 members of Parliament. They manage to escape before he gets there. And at this point, Charles realizes he's got to get out of there. He doesn't have a lot of support. So he's forced to flee to the north, and he raises an army in the north. Parliament then also raises their own army in London. And now you have the stage set for war. Parliament calls their army the New Model Army. So basically, the English Civil War is a war between Parliament and their army and the king and his army, mostly because of those issues and the tensions that had been building ever since James I became king. So we're going to stop this video here. There's a couple of questions that you'll answer and kind of process the events and really the root causes of the Civil War. The next video will get into the war and the aftermath of the war.